Hi, welcome to Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District's presentation on rusty crayfish, lawnmowers of the lake, and of course other aquatic invasive species and the impacts that they have on our native ecosystems. We're going to walk through with some visits from our guest Ralph the rusty crayfish about aquatic invasive species and some other information about some management work that we've been doing at the SWCD. This is Ralph. Hi, I'm Ralph. I'm a rusty crayfish, and I'm a Minnesota invasive species. So AIS, or aquatic invasive species, are invasive species that are in the water. For something to be invasive, it has to be non-native to an area, meaning it's not from there, and it has to cause some sort of harm, whether that be environmental, economic, or to human health. Generally, aquatic invasive species will threaten all three of those things, but often will threaten the natural resources. Why do you think invasive species are good at being invasive? Minnesota regulates invasive species in two primary different ways. There are prohibited species like the sea lamprey pictured here, and you're never allowed to have a prohibited invasive species in your possession. Zebra mussels, sea lamprey, a few other species. There are also regulated species, meaning it's legal to possess them, but you cannot introduce them into any waters. Rusty crayfish are regulated invasive species. This means, like it says on the slide, that you can sell, purchase, transport, or keep rusty crayfish in a tank, but you can't put them into the lake unless you have a very special, very hard to get permit. You want to always follow clean, drain, dry recommendations to prevent further introductions of aquatic invasive species into a lake. This regulates transport of those prohibited and regulated species. Some of the laws for clean, drain, dry include you can't transport a watercraft without removing a drain plug. You can't arrive at a lake access with a drain plug in place. You can't transport aquatic plants, zebra mussels, or the other prohibited species on any roadway. You can't launch a watercraft with a prohibited species attached, and you can't transport water from Minnesota lakes or rivers. That includes water in your minnow bait. So I asked earlier why you think invasives are so good at being invasive. Well, one of the primary reasons is that they're generalists. They can survive anywhere, so they're really good at adapting to different environments. Invasive species are also very aggressive. If you can think of the Burmese python pictured in this photo and how aggressive pythons are, it's easy for them to colonize and adapt into a new environment. Burmese pythons and other large snakes have overwhelmed the Everglades in Florida, and there's even a snake by the foot bounty out for snakes right now because of the impact they're doing to that ecosystem. One of the key aspects of invasive species is that they can often go into an ecosystem or habitat, some sort of area where they don't actually have any predators either. There's no predator that's going to kill a Burmese python in the Everglades unless you count humans. Invasive species are also really successful at reproduction. So if you see the picture on the bottom left, bighead carp in Minnesota are really good at reproducing, so they can have lots of babies and to easily take over an entire river or lake. You can also see they're very aggressive. There are YouTube videos out there of carp flying out of the water and landing in your boat. Not a fish that I'd want to get hit in the head with. They also have a low susceptibility to disease. Cane toads in Australia are actually poisonous, and so they won't even be predated upon or killed or eaten by other species, and they're not likely to die from any viruses or pathogens or anything that can kill them. So these are some famous examples of invasive species around the world. We're going to walk through an example of how aquatic invasive species or any invasive species can take over an area. We're going to use Dumbbell Lake as our example. You can see the red dot where Dumbbell Lake is located in Lake County, up the shore just past Finland near Isabella area off of Highway 1. So if we look at Dumbbell Lake up near Isabella here, we have crayfish trapping data from 2005 for the total rusty crayfish catch. We found a median, or sort of an average, of rusty crayfish at just 0 per trap. We only caught 2 total in 5 traps that we've been trapping for the last 10 plus years. In 2011, after the introduction was more robust, we caught an average of 15 crayfish per trap with 166 total. By 2015, we were catching 32 crayfish per trap at a total of 503. It's a lot of crayfish in just 10 years. Our last intensive trapping on Dumbbell Lake had an average of 16 crayfish per trap. We still have no species that have been found, no native crayfish species that have been found on Dumbbell Lake at 15 years plus after the initial catch of 2 crayfish. Catch numbers have gone down a little bit in 2018 and 2019. So invasive species are bad for a couple different reasons. Like we saw in that example, they decrease biodiversity, they displace native species from their habitats, they can reduce recreation opportunities. That's a big problem for zebra mussels that can litter the beaches in a lot of popular swimming areas. They change the food chain, so animals have to eat different things. They can also decrease property values, spread disease, increase allergies, irritations, all sorts of different things. Faucet snails, which are an invasive snail in our area, they actually carry a disease with them that kills coots and other waterfowl and ducks. Biodiversity, in summary, is, of course, the spice of life. Rusty crayfish, which we're talking about here in this presentation, they originated from the Ohio River Basin. As an invasive species, they have impacts on their environment, human health, and the economy. Rusty crayfish are often known as the lawnmowers of the lake. They're very voracious, or they eat a lot. They eat entire bays of aquatic vegetation, and they'll also eat fish eggs, reducing food and habitat or homes for native fish. They further displace other native crayfish. They're very large and aggressive, and they reproduce rapidly, so they're really good at being invasive. We've even seen rusty crayfish have impacts on wild rice populations, especially when other food sources are limited. Invasive species can get into lakes through a variety of different ways. As we noted in our example with Dumbbell Lake, rusty crayfish were likely introduced to this lake by bait bucket release from anglers. They could have also been introduced into Dumbbell Lake as specimens. So if like a teacher or someone at home was keeping a tank with crayfish in them and released them into a local water body. We know crayfish are used in some bass fishing, but most anglers are very responsible and dump their bait when leaving, so as not to introduce any new species to a different waterway. Rusty crayfish were first found in Minnesota in 1999. Can you think of other ways aquatic invasive species can be introduced? So how do you identify rusty crayfish? Well, they can be distinguished from other crayfish by the rusty red spot on their carapace, or the side of their body. They can also be distinguished by orange-tipped claws with black rings around them, and also by a rusty band going down their tail. Rusty crayfish claws are also oval-shaped and close completely. There is no gap on their claws. There are a lot of other native crayfish in this area. One of the ones you'll often see are calico crayfish. Calico crayfish are sometimes found in lakes around here, especially in muddier areas like Lax Lake. Calico crayfish, or Orconectus immunis, have a camouflage-like coloring. Unlike other crayfish in the area, calico crayfish also have small tufts of hair in the center of their claw where it closes and forms a notch or gap. You also might see virile crayfish. Virile crayfish are crayfish with orange-red tips on their claws, but they don't have black bands like our rusty crayfish do, and they have 2 to 4 rows of spots down their tail. Feral crayfish often appear to have bluish claws with white dots, but not always. Another common native crayfish that you might see are northern clearwater crayfish. Clearwater crayfish are common in a lot of our riverways, like the Baptism River. Clearwater crayfish have a thick black band and orange tips on their claws, just like rusty crayfish. But unlike rusty crayfish, they have a black band on their tail rather than a rusty red one, and that band appears in a V shape. Clearwater crayfish usually have a brown or gray body color and aren't very bumpy on their sides. So when we have invasive species like rusty crayfish, we want to manage them so that they don't take over our waters. Prevention, like those clean, drain, dry guidelines, is of course one of the best ways to do that, but Lake SWCD has also explored ways in which we can trap them. It is, of course, official business. One of the ways Lake SWCD started a lot of our trapping work was through an Initiative Foundation grant called Arrest the Spread of Rusty Non-Native Crayfish in the Boundary Waters. This grant approached management from a couple of different ways. We wanted to try public outreach, we wanted to identify where infestations were, we wanted to conduct some intensive trapping in specific areas, and we wanted to get volunteers to do trapping in a social way as well. Now, most of our management occurs through AIS prevention funds for Lake County out of the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District. Rusty crayfish trapping consists of a couple of different things. We trap intensively in certain areas, that social or volunteer trapping I mentioned. Students sometimes trap them, and staff, and we also trap rusty crayfish for events like crayfish boils. Rolf here again. I was caught on Dumbbell Lake by Paul and others from the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District. I was caught in a trap baited with chunks of white sucker. The white suckers are used by permit and are donated by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Tower and Finland Area Fisheries. All trapping regulations for bait fish apply. If you're interested in trapping rusty crayfish, contact your local conservation officer for more about how to do this and the regulations that apply. You can call conservation officers for an information line at 888-646-6367, or you can find their patrol areas online. Before, Ralph here again, of course, before, 24 hours later, me holding white sucker bones. Ugh. The biggest haul of the trapping was 82 of us rusty crayfish, in one trap. 57 traps were set out for that outreach event. We can be tough to count. When we're trapping areas like Dumbbell Lake, we also check for other things like zebra mussels, just to see if they're infesting the waters. So far, so good. You can see all the different yellow, red, and orange dots around the arrowhead of places where there are rusty crayfish. Red dots are areas where there are more crayfish, and yellow, not many. You can see there are a lot of rusty crayfish near the White Iron Chain of Lakes area right by Ely. Some of the intensive trapping we did measured crayfish sizes to see how that changed our catch numbers or management efforts. This happened primarily in 2015 and 2016, with some work in 2017 too. Students were able to enter the boundary waters daily via canoe, setting traps for rusty crayfish. That would be a fun job. You can see here the boundary waters entry point in the star, and then or the yellow pin, and then all the other rusty crayfish trapping locations. White, where no crayfish were caught, green, where native crayfish were caught, and red, where rusties were caught. This is from 2015. Our intensive trapping showed that rusty crayfish averaged 4.51 centimeters in 2016. Native catch rates throughout the years, so native crayfish populations remain low. There was a slight decline in rusty crayfish populations, but often invasive species infestations will go up and they'll peak and then they'll sort of ebb back to a stasis. Some of the other management work we do is working with volunteers to do social trapping. In 2017, for instance, we had 29 different volunteer crayfish trappers on the White Iron Chain of Lakes that are part of the Lake Association trapping on their docks. They caught almost 5,000 rusty crayfish on the White Iron Chain in 2017. Anecdotally, or sort of what people have noticed, is that they're seeing some of the wild rice beds and aquatic plants rebound or come back as some of these rusty crayfish populations near their dock are depleted. Volunteers and their crayfish data has shown that Garden Lake is infested all over the place. Birch Lake up there is generally not infested, and South Farm, and White Iron Lakes have seen gradual increases in rusty crayfish infestations. This shows an increase at both Farm and Garden Lakes. There's a slight impact on the data from 2011 as different bait was used. Native crayfish populations have gone down very fast in South Farm Lake, which is an entry to the boundary waters. White Iron Lake shows the trend at the top there that we would expect for rusty crayfish, a decline in natives paired with a rise in rusty crayfish. Lakes with geographic barriers or long, narrow lakes do not see the same rusty crayfish expansion as lakes that are sort of like one big circle. This graphing and map shows Birch Lake, which has seen a few crayfish pop up in the center of the lake in 2017, but we have not seen a huge expansion of rusty crayfish from the South Kawishwe area or the northeastern corner of the lake. White Iron, another lake near there, has a few more crayfish than in previous years, but the increase is isolated to the west shore. So when we have geographically sinuous or like looking like a snake lakes, they tend not to increase as quickly with the rusty crayfish. You see Farm Lake here, our population, it's nice and round and the populations are consistent and high. You see the graphs show very similar data at all trap sites and over time. Garden Lake already had a high rusty crayfish population, which has stayed high. There are some locations where we saw slight increases, but overall, this is about the same as Farm. White Iron Lake, sort of like Birch, has seen variation. So this is that more sinuous lake again, and we've seen rusty crayfish confined mostly to the South Shore White Iron, or West Shore White Iron. South Shore White Iron has had native species. You can see all the different rusty crayfish infestations at Birch, White Iron, Farm, Garden, and South Farm Lakes in this picture. The yellow dots have relatively little rusty crayfish and red a lot more. This shows rusty crayfish populations from 2005 to 2017. One of the best ways that we can manage rusty crayfish, if not through trapping, which isn't always effective, but is through education, like we're chatting with you now, and different sorts of prevention. So you want to spread the word to your friends about rusty crayfish and what they do to our lakes. You can also see us occasionally in the summers at rusty crayfish boils at our farmers markets or various events. If you want to have a rusty crayfish boil near your own home with native crayfish or rusty crayfish, you can help. If you can't beat the invasive species, you can eat them, right? Ralph doesn't like that so much, but the SWCD says that's a great idea. Always contact your conservation officer and follow all applicable bait and trapping regulations. Thank you so much for listening. This concludes our presentation on rusty crayfish. Remember to clean, drain, dry.